Have you ever been looked straight through like a shadow that shouldn't exist in that space? Standing in a room of elegance with every proof that you belong, yet the shade of your skin alone is enough for someone to doubt you, enough for them to block your path and say, "Sorry, we just need to check a little more." Tessa Caldwell knows that feeling all too well. Not once, not twice, but all her life. That morning at the airport, she wasn't just pulled aside for one security screening. It happened twice. Randomly, they said. But this kind of random only seemed to apply to people who looked like her. Tessa had every reason to be angry, to raise her voice, to turn the place into a battleground. But she didn't, because Tessa had a greater aim, not just to defend her own dignity, but to make those who think they have the right to judge others face the mirror themselves. And you know what's interesting? They had no idea that the woman they were underestimating could bring this entire flight to a halt. The story you're about to hear isn't just about prejudice. It's about the power of silence, of calculated moves made in the shadows, and about the moment when someone who truly holds power decides not to warn anymore, but to act. Before I tell you the rest, if you believe this story deserves to be heard, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Racist Exposed and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories. Because every story we share peels back another layer of fog from the truth. And so, what looked like an ordinary morning at the airport became the day an entire airline was forced to take a hard look at itself. It all began when Tessa Caldwell stepped up to the security gate, first-class ticket in hand, and a pair of cold eyes stopped her in her tracks. The airport in the morning has its own rhythm. The scrape of suitcase wheels over tile, the clipped voice of announcements breaking between sighs. Tessa Caldwell stepped into that picture like a color you couldn't ignore. A turquoise blazer fitting neatly across her shoulders, collar just so, a vintage brown leather case gliding at her side. She didn't have to try to draw attention, but eyes found her the way a compass finds north. A cluster of passengers stood in line at the security gate. When Tessa approached, a few lips moved. Questions unspoken but clear enough. Who is she? A woman clutching a laptop leaned toward her friend, eyes still fixed on Tessa. Some glances held curiosity, others suspicion, as if weighing whether she was VIP or just lucky. Ahead of her, a white man in a gray suit stepped through the scanner. No one stopped him, no questions, no pause. He strolled through in seconds. The security officer smiled in greeting like an old acquaintance. Tessa watched, lips curling, not quite a smile, more like someone seeing a scene from a film they've watched too many times. When her turn came, a hand shot out, slicing the flow of movement. The officer's face was a blank mask, his voice even. The system selected you at random. Please step to the side for screening. The word random hit Tessa like a familiar code, summoning old reels at Paris airport, at London train station, at a Tokyo hotel entrance. Random always seemed to mean people who looked like her. She met his gaze. Not challenging, not submissive, just long enough for him to realize he wasn't facing someone easy to box in. As the search began, she watched the space around her. The man in the gray suit had vanished from sight, but the contrast between how he passed and how she was stopped remained vivid, like fresh ink not yet dry. She opened her suitcase. Fingers sifted through shirts, her tablet, a hardback book. Nothing. There could never be anything. Yet their eyes seemed to hope for that aha moment to justify the stop. She tilted her head, a faint smile. "I hope you find what you're looking for." The words drifted like smoke, making him pause half a beat, uncertain if it was courtesy or a barb. They let her go. But Tessa knew this was only the opening move. Anyone who believed they held control would soon learn this board wasn't theirs. The turquoise blazer would be seen again in this airport, each time carrying a different story. The security officer's raised hand had been like a gate slammed shut, blocking the straight path to the scanner. His voice carried just enough for nearby passengers to turn their heads. "Random screening, please step this way." That word rolled from his mouth like a pebble down a familiar slope, landing square in Tessa's memory of every time random wasn't random at all. She followed him into the secondary inspection area. It was smaller here with cold white lighting that stripped away warmth. On the table, her leather case lay waiting, about to be pried open like a book flipped for the last page. The lock clicked. His eyes scanned each compartment, fingers brushing over the smooth fabric of a shirt, tapping the cover of her book, turning a small cosmetics case. Each item was lifted, examined, and set down with an air of dissatisfaction, as though neatness itself was suspect. Tessa stood still, eyes tracking his every move. A wry thought crossed her mind. If this persistence were put toward finding a better job, he'd probably be a great success. A female officer approached, giving Tessa a quick up and down before asking her colleague, loud enough for the line outside to hear, "Do we need to search personal items too?" Someone chuckled under their breath. Tessa smiled, not to appease, but like someone hearing an overplayed story. Do whatever you think you need to do. After nearly 5 minutes, the search ended. Nothing, as expected. He returned the case without meeting her eyes, as if the failure wasn't worth acknowledging. She took the handle, tilting her head. "I hope you found what you were looking for." It was light but sharp enough to lodge in memory. She walked back into the crowd, still feeling the weight of eyes on her. Tessa knew they rarely stopped after one move, and this morning had the distinct feel of a warm-up round. At an information pillar, she slid out her phone. A quick 8-word message, sent in under 5 seconds. Whoever received it wouldn't ignore it. Phone away, she moved on, the earlier scene replayed in her mind like an opening chess gambit. Her opponent thinking they'd gained the advantage. She smiled again, this time only to herself. A catering cart rolled by. The attendant caught her gaze and quickly looked away as though realizing something they shouldn't. Tessa didn't react. Some battles are best delayed, because timing is the deadliest strike. The departure board read, "Boarding in 20 minutes. Plenty of time to watch, to listen, to remember the faces she might see again." She walked toward the gate, posture straight, eyes steady. Anyone watching might think she'd just finished a routine screening, but she knew. This wasn't the end of a check. It was the start of a chain of events someone would wish they'd never set in motion. Somewhere in an airline office, a phone was about to ring. Tessa had barely cleared security, her suitcase rolling in a steady rhythm beside her. The corridor ahead stretched like a runway, golden light spilling from the ceiling in uneven patches across the tiles. The scent of coffee from a nearby cafe drifted in, carrying a trace of warmth after the cold glare of the screening area. She had just let her shoulders ease when a figure stepped from a side passage, cutting across her path. Dark navy uniform, polished nameplate, shoes so shiny they reflected the overhead lights. No introduction was needed. The stance, the quick sweep of his eyes from head to toe told her he was a security manager. "Excuse me, Miss Caldwell?" His voice was more courteous than the last officer's, but with a steel edge that couldn't be hidden. "I'm afraid we need to recheck your luggage." Tessa stopped, tilting her head as if unsure she'd heard correctly. "Recheck? I just passed through security less than a minute ago." He nodded slightly, his face still wearing the practiced politeness honed over years. "We've received an alert that your bag may have been tampered with after the initial screening." The phrase rang false, a warped copy of truth. May have been tampered with. 4 words like an all-access pass to pull anyone back into inspection, no matter the reason. Tessa's smile was faint, not at the plausibility, but at the clumsy creativity of the excuse. "So someone managed to slip in and alter my luggage in this crowded hallway in under 60 seconds? A flush of red flickered on his face, though his tone stayed even. "We're just following protocol." Around them, a few people slowed down, watching. A man in a baseball cap shook his head, murmuring to his companion. A young woman lifted her phone, pretending to text, but angling it just enough to record. Tessa felt the weight of their eyes, some pitying, some curious, and some quietly pleased to watch someone pulled from the flow. Her hand rested on the suitcase handle, neither pulling it away nor offering it. The air seemed to still, save for the hum of ventilation and scattered footsteps. "If you believe that's necessary," she said slowly, "then go ahead, but I'll be with my bag every step of the way." Her voice wasn't loud, but sharp enough to make the manager lean back slightly. He nodded, gesturing toward a small side door to a private screening area. As it opened, Tessa knew the game had just changed its rules. The hallway to the room was short, but the laughter behind them stretched like an invisible thread wrapping around her steps. Not loud bursts, just little snickers, small enough to deny if confronted, clear enough for everyone to know the target. A woman's voice sliced through the thick air, probably never flown first class before. Tessa didn't stop, but her eyes slid sideways. The glance landed on a white woman with softly curled blonde hair, legs crossed, a designer bag perched lightly on her lap. In that instant, the smirk faded from the woman's lips. Without a word, Tessa's look did its work, a reminder that some remarks echo far longer in the speaker's own mind than they intended. The security manager kept walking, but Tessa caught the faint tightening of his shoulders. He'd heard it too and could feel the attention gathering. Inside the screening room, another officer was waiting. 4 bare white walls, a long table, and a lone scanner in the corner. The neon light drained all color from the space. "Place your bag on the table," the officer said, curt and without pretense. Tessa set it down, her hand still gripping the handle, a quiet signal she wouldn't leave it unattended for even a second. The lock clicked open. One by one, items were lifted, turned over, and set down with thinly veiled impatience. Tessa stayed still, eyes tracking every movement. Each time they set something down, she tilted her head slightly, not appraising the object, but the person holding it. "Do you fly first class often?" the manager asked. It sounded casual, but held a note of probing. Tessa's reply was unhurried. "More often than the people who think I don't belong there." A brief pause, then more rummaging. As expected, nothing. They closed the case without a word, avoiding her gaze. The manager gestured to the door. Tessa rolled her bag out, the wheels clicking evenly against the tiles. A reminder the game wasn't over. Outside, the passengers still lingered. The blonde woman was still in her seat, but now her eyes avoided Tessa's. As Tessa passed, she left nothing but a faint trace of perfume and an unease that would linger far longer. This had only been round 2. And the third move? That's when the board begins to turn. When the door shut behind her, Tessa didn't move right away. She stood still, feeling the space ahead of her open. The hallway was quieter now, an announcement for another passenger echoing faintly, mingling with the roll of distant luggage wheels. She pulled her suitcase to the side, stepped into a patch of mottled ceiling light, and took out her phone. The screen reflected her face. Not angry, not shaken, just still as water before a storm. Her fingers moved quickly. The message was 8 words. Time to see how they play this next. She sent it. The screen went dark. No name, no description for the recipient, but Tessa knew. Once it reached them, the next act would have an audience. The phone went back into her pocket. She gripped the handle and walked on. This time, there was no rush. Every step measured distance, timing, and the faces now appearing in her view. At the cafe near Gate 7, a group of flight attendants chatted, glancing her way. A ground staff member, recognizing her, turned quickly into the crew lounge. Tessa registered it all. Nothing escaped. Passing the duty-free perfume display, she stopped for half a second. Her fingers brushed the amber glass of a bottle, lifting the cap to breathe it in before setting it back. The sales clerk's eyes followed her, curious. Tessa only smiled and walked on, leaving a faint ribbon of scent behind, like the subtle mark she left in every encounter, no matter how small. On the far board, the lettering shifted, announcing another completed boarding. The loudspeaker called passengers to Gate 12. Tessa checked her watch. There was time for one more scene. Because she knew, when someone believes they've gotten away with 2 strikes without pushback, they won't stop at 2. They'll come for a third, and it's in that third round the board truly flips. She walked on, gaze steady, mind already setting the pieces. A game needs enough moves for the player to feel secure. Before they realized the hand moving the pieces was never theirs. And somewhere unnoticed by the crowd, someone had just received Tessa's message and was stepping onto the stage. The hallway to the check-in counter moved like a slow current. Rolling suitcases, murmured conversations, and the distant voice of an overhead announcement. Tessa walked toward it, the light from the tall windows spilling across her teal blazer, making the fabric stand out sharply against the silver-gray palette of the terminal. The first-class counter sat in a quieter corner, apart from the economy bustle. Black cushioned seats and a polished wood desk, promising a different tier of service. Only 2 agents were working, each with a passenger. Tessa stepped forward as one of the agents, a young woman, became free. She handed over her first-class ticket with a smooth, unhurried motion, as though she'd done it hundreds of times. The woman took it, but instead of the professional smile or brief nod, her eyes flicked over the ticket, then up at Tessa, hesitating. A squint. It lasted only a heartbeat, but was enough to signal the ticket was under a mental microscope. The scanner's green light swept across it, giving a confirming beep. Yet instead of printing a luggage tag, the agent's eyes drifted back to Tessa, scanning her from head to toe as if searching for something out of place. Tessa smiled faintly, not in greeting, but in the way someone does when they know they're being quietly measured. "This ticket?" The agent paused. "You're sure it's first class?" The question was loud enough for a few nearby passengers to hear. A man in a dark suit glanced up from his phone, then went back to typing. Tessa's gaze stayed fixed on the agent, unblinking. Inwardly, she thought. Her tone has more exclamation points than question marks. "I didn't just buy first class," Tessa replied slowly. "I chose it." The agent froze for a fraction of a second before turning back to her screen, shoulders slightly stiffening, fingers moving faster over the keyboard. Tessa placed her suitcase on the scale, keeping a hand on the handle until the number appeared. The agent bent over, making a note on her screen. The faint reflection in the glass counter let Tessa glimpse part of the note. A line of text the woman didn't know was visible to someone with the highest system access. Tessa stayed silent. But her silence was not empty. It was the pause between chapters in a book where the reader has no idea what comes next. She knew she had just left a breadcrumb, and that breadcrumb would lead them exactly where she wanted. "You're sure you bought first class? This tier isn't for promotional fares." The words dropped like a pebble into still water, rippling outward to nearby ears. A man in a white shirt suppressed a smirk. A middle-aged woman slowed her rolling suitcase, giving Tessa a curious once-over. Tessa didn't drop her posture, her shoulders stayed high. Again, she thought. Too many exclamation points. And those exclamation points, if left alone, become invisible hooks hanging over the person they're aimed at. "I'm more certain than the people who think they know where others belong." Her voice wasn't loud, but every word landed with the clean strike of metal on a table. The agent blinked. The answer wasn't angry, yet it closed the door on any attempt at softening. It was a straight line. One side for her, one side for Tessa. The space around the counter seemed to grow heavier. The distant announcement still played, but nearby, the silence swallowed everything. A few people in line adjusted their stance for a better view. The agent's fingers moved faster now, but her eyes flicked up occasionally, as if hoping to catch a reaction. Tessa gave her none. Her focus stayed on the suitcase, sitting firmly on the scale as proof that everything here was in its rightful place. Then, at just the right moment, Tessa lowered her gaze again, catching another faint reflection of the screen. A new note the agent had typed. Short, but clear. "Check again at boarding." If this was a trap, it was a clumsy one. Tessa didn't erase it. Sometimes the smartest move isn't dismantling someone's plan, but letting them believe it's working, right until they step into it themselves. She drew her gaze back, giving a thin smile. "Thank you. I'll remember what you said." The agent looked down, avoiding eye contact, printed the luggage tag, and slid the suitcase back. Tessa took it, pulling it toward her. This wasn't over. It had just been entered into the record of a far longer play. Her fingers moved across the keyboard again, the internal notes window flashing open like a backstage whisper. More words appeared, each keystroke feeding into a private script. If the writer knew who was really reading every internal note in the system, her hands might freeze mid-typing, but she didn't. Tessa stood still, watching the web being spun. Amateur traps always reveal themselves to the patient. The luggage tag pressed into place. The agent offered a smile that barely touched her eyes. "Enjoy your flight." The tone had shifted, less confident now. Tessa nodded in place of a reply. In her mind, that note was already a stored puzzle piece, part of a growing picture. And the more complete the picture, the cleaner her move would be. Leaving the counter, she merged into the stream of passengers. Her steps slowed, not from hesitation, but calculation. A quick response wouldn't do. The right moment would. An airline staffer passed, arms full of files, offering Tessa a polite nod. She returned it with a small smile, one that carried a glint visible only to those fluent in this game. Because the final approval on every passenger record, public or internal, belonged to one person, and that person was Tessa Caldwell. She didn't need to delete the note. She would keep it, like a footprint left in the sand, and later point to it for the whole beach to see. When the boarding screen in the distance flickered, she tightened her grip on the suitcase handle, her smile thin but sharp. Not the smile of someone marked for extra scrutiny, but of someone who had just marked her marker. And at the gate, someone was about to realize they'd been invited into a play they didn't know she was directing. The first-class lounge was tucked away at the end of the hallway, where the carpet was so thick it seemed to swallow footsteps, and the warm gold lighting cast everything in a soft, understated luxury. The scent of new leather from the gleaming armchairs mingled with the aroma of freshly roasted coffee, creating an atmosphere that made you believe you'd stepped outside the rush of the world beyond. The glass doors slid open with a gentle hiss as Tessa walked in. Her teal blazer instantly became the focal point in a space dominated by neutral tones: gray, beige, and navy. Overhead lights sharpened the cut of her suit, as if she'd stepped out of a magazine spread. To the left was a small bar, where uniformed staff poured white wine into slender crystal glasses. To the right, rows of soft leather chairs hosted men in suits and women in business dresses, their low conversations blending with the soft rustle of magazine pages. As she passed through, a few gazes lingered longer than necessary, not out of recognition, but because her presence broke the visual uniformity of the room. She wasn't the default color here. Still, she neither slowed nor sought to blend in. She moved as if the lounge was just another corridor to pass through on the way to somewhere that mattered more. Each step on the plush carpet was firm yet soundless. Far ahead, large windows framed the tarmac, letting in strips of pale afternoon sunlight. Tessa angled toward them, but paused when she caught her reflection in the glass. A solitary woman so distinct that even her shadow seemed unwilling to blend. She adjusted her collar, not because it needed fixing, but as a small acknowledgement to herself that she belonged here as naturally as anyone else. But in places designed to look flawless, the smallest details could reveal cracks. And Tessa knew that just a few more steps would take her into a space where those cracks would show, in words not meant for the ears of their subject. Because in closed rooms, whispers traveled farther than the loudest announcements. She had barely passed the second row of seats when a voice cut across the lounge's quiet. Not a greeting, not a question, just the tone of a young woman, pitch small enough to feign privacy, but large enough to be heard by the intended listener. She's probably some executive's girlfriend. Tessa didn't stop, but in that moment the sound slid in like a thin blade, hitting the one place without armor. A soft laugh followed, older, deeper, tinged with agreement. In a single breath, it carried an assumption honed over years that someone like Tessa could only be here attached to a name, never on her own merit. Her posture remained unshaken, as if the words hadn't existed. But her eyes found the source in the reflection off the bar's glass. Two flight attendants standing close, coffee cups in hand. Sunlight framed the curve of their lips as they spoke, and the quick dart of their eyes toward her before they retreated wary of being caught. If she had chosen a moment to respond, this would have been it. But she didn't. Instead, she stopped at a table by the window, set her suitcase on the chair, and pulled out her phone. From the outside, she was checking flight times. Inside, every syllable they had spoken was etched into her memory, not in ink or sound, but in the recall of someone who knew how to wait. She sipped her water, gaze still fixed on the runway. Every move was precise, without a wasted gesture, as if she'd heard nothing. But the observant would know. Her silence was not dismissal, but a quiet entry in a much longer ledger. A passing waiter glanced from Tessa to the two attendants. There was something in his look, recognition, maybe warning, but Tessa didn't need an interpreter. Because she knew one truth. The most dangerous cuts often came disguised as harmless whispers. And sometimes the best reply was to let them float, until the speaker forgot they'd ever said them, only to have them return when least expected. For now, she would let them think she hadn't heard. Silence, after all, was the best curtain before the stage lights came up. She set her glass down, the reflection on the table's surface scattering like silver threads. Outside, a plane taxied toward the runway, engines humming steadily. Her eyes followed it for a few seconds, though her mind was elsewhere, on two laughs that had just planted seeds in the quiet afternoon of this lounge. She turned her phone slightly in her hand, its dark screen catching the scene behind her. In it, a man in a company vest had just appeared, his face neutral at first, then shifting as if he'd recognized something unexpected. His gaze locked on Tessa. In one breath, his expression changed, from casual to recognizing to unsettled, then quickly to something he tried to mask. He slowed but didn't approach. Instead, he veered, slipping behind the service counter, and through a door marked for staff. Tessa didn't turn. She saw it all in the glass and in the subtle shift of others watching him leave. A male attendant by the door blinked, silently asking, "What was that?" but got no answer. She smiled faintly, lifting one corner of her mouth. It wasn't for anyone in the room, it was for herself. Because she knew what had just happened was a vital clue. Someone had recognized her, and that recognition would spread if he managed to speak. But he wouldn't, or perhaps wouldn't get the chance. She knew the rules behind the scenes. News needed a carrier, and if the carrier vanished, the news stayed locked, until she decided otherwise. She took another measured sip of water, placing the glass down with the composure of someone who knew she stood in the center of a wave only she could see the path of. Across the room, the two attendants kept chatting, unaware that their stage now had a powerful audience. And somewhere behind that staff door, someone was deciding what to do with the knowledge they'd just stumbled upon. Tessa leaned back slightly, eyes toward the window. Outside, the plane began its takeoff, nose lifting into the sky. She knew that when she turned back, the room wouldn't feel the same as when she'd entered. Because once someone recognized you, the game no longer played out in silence. And here, in this airport, the first sound had just been made, though it was only the hurried footsteps of a man leaving the room. First class was a world apart from the rest of the plane. Here, everything was wrapped in expensive quiet. Seats as wide as armchairs in a luxury living room, lighting as warm and golden as an autumn afternoon, and the hum of the air system replacing all the noise outside. Tessa stepped in, her teal blazer still perfectly pressed, her small carry-on stowed neatly in the overhead bin by a flight attendant. She slid into her seat, the cushion soft enough to feel like a cloud wrung dry. In front of her, a glass of champagne waited, tiny bubbles racing to the surface. Overhead light spilled down, forming a faint halo around the glass, the kind of glow the airline wanted to wrap this experience in. But Tessa knew that the prettiest light didn't always reach the shadows. She took a sip, the crisp tang and ripe grape scent spreading across her tongue. It was perfect, exactly as first class was scripted to be. And yet, she'd learned that when things felt too perfect, it meant a different kind of scene was being prepared backstage. Leaning back, she let her eyes wander. Passengers around her were absorbed in their phones, their books, or simply resting with eyes closed. Across the aisle, a man glanced at her through the frosted partition, only to pull back quickly when her gaze met his. The cabin carried that distinct blend of new leather and high-end perfume. It reminded Tessa of closed-door boardrooms, where every word was wrapped in politeness but laced with subtext. And she had the distinct sense that this flight's story wouldn't end with drinks and warm towels. Her fingers slowly turned the stem of her glass, sending tiny ripples across the champagne's surface. This calm moment felt like the soft introduction of a symphony. Gentle, composed. But she knew the coming notes wouldn't keep the same rhythm. Outside, sunlight filtered through thin layers of cloud, casting a hazy glow that made everything seem both near and far. Tessa took a long breath, savoring the temporary peace, but her mind was already ready for when it would be torn apart. Because experience had taught her, in places where seats were separated by the smallest digits, there was always someone who believed their number mattered more than the name printed on your ticket. And in just a few steps, first class was about to meet someone who thought they had the right to decide where she should sit. Footsteps stopped right in front of her, slicing through her thoughts. She looked up to see a tall white man in his 40s, crisp white shirt, silver gray tie. His expression carried that mix of polite civility and quiet possession. "I think you're in the wrong seat." His voice wasn't loud, but it was pitched to carry to nearby rows. Tessa set her champagne on the side table, eyes locked on his. "The wrong seat?" "Yes," he emphasized, glancing at the ticket in his hand as proof. "This is my seat." Before she could answer, a flight attendant arrived, leaning toward her. The smile was there, but the eyes were cold steel. "Sorry, may I see your ticket again?" The way she said "again" wasn't just procedure. It was an invitation to prove something that shouldn't need proving. Tessa opened her bag, retrieving the ticket without hurry. Every movement was calm, as if time itself had slowed. She handed it over, never breaking eye contact with the man. The attendant's eyes flicked down, and there was the slightest pause before she masked it. Tessa took the ticket back, placing it on the table. "Is there a problem?" Her voice was soft but edged. "No, it's just sometimes the system," the attendant began. Tessa cut in. "Sometimes the system makes people believe what they think matters more than what's real." Silence spread through the cabin. The man's mouth pressed thin, his gaze wavering. Nearby passengers pretended to read or scroll, but their ears were locked on her words. The attendant's professional smile returned. "Of course, this is your seat. We just wanted to be certain." Tessa nodded once. She picked up her champagne, took a slow sip, letting the bubbles rise as if nothing had happened. But in her eyes, there was a new promise. This wouldn't be the last time they heard her voice today. Because those who think they've kept order rarely realize they've just set a storm in motion. She set the glass down, the golden reflection on its surface like the last calm before rain. Buttoning her blazer, she rose, deliberately. The attendant and the man both startled, expecting her to gather her things and leave. But Tessa didn't reach for her bag, nor did she head for the aisle. Instead, she stood tall, turning to face forward, her gaze sweeping the cabin. Without a word, she took in not just the faces avoiding her eyes, but those openly watching. Someone lowered their gaze to a phone, scrolling without purpose. Another pretended to dig in a bag, though their posture tilted forward, listening. First class was designed for everyone to remain in their own private bubble, but Tessa had broken that structure. Just by standing in the aisle, she'd shifted the air, forcing the space to breathe differently. Her eyes landed on the back row, where a man in a dark suit was holding a magazine, unmoved since she'd stood up. In any other cabin, it might have been curiosity. Here it was anticipation, waiting to see what she'd do next. She didn't rush. Each second passed like a chess player weighing her next move. The steady drone of the engines mingled with the soft clink of a spoon against a glass somewhere down the row. Then, she turned back to her seat, sat down, and lifted her champagne. Looking toward the man from before, she said, "You see, sometimes all it takes is a change in perspective, and the whole board shifts." Her words fell like a small stone into still water, sending quiet ripples outward. No one replied, but Tessa knew the right people had heard. She leaned back, eyes on the window where a streak of white cloud drifted past. To anyone watching, she'd left the conversation, but in truth, she'd just marked the entire cabin onto her map. Because the game only truly began once people realized they were pieces on the board. The first-class door closed with a clean, sharp click, yet the sound seemed to linger longer than it should in the already dense air. Outside, ground staff were still moving along the tarmac, but inside, everything felt slower. The plane was nearly ready for departure. A flight attendant began checking passengers' seatbelts row by row, but her pace noticeably slowed when she approached Tessa. The delay wasn't about caution, it was because every set of eyes in the cabin had begun to tilt in one direction. Tessa sat still, back straight, hands resting lightly on the armrests. The posture wasn't just about composure, it was a way of holding territory. If anyone wanted to touch this moment, they'd have to step onto her ground. Across the aisle, a man pretended to rearrange his laptop but was sneaking glances at her. In front, an older woman turned her face just enough to study the woman in that seat, perhaps to see if she was truly calm or only hiding something. No one spoke, but Tessa could feel the waiting in their eyes, the anticipation to see how she would react, what would happen next. It was like walking into a room and realizing a conversation had stopped just before you arrived. From the rear, another attendant moved forward, exchanging a few quiet words with a colleague by the door. The volume was so low that only a muffled hum reached Tessa's ears, but she knew they were speaking about her. Not a guess. She recognized the particular tone in their glances, the same tone people used when they read your name off a list you didn't want to be on. She didn't move. She didn't change her expression. She let her stillness make their restlessness stand out even more. It was a lesson she'd learned long ago. In rooms full of people trying to unsettle you, your own steadiness is the most disruptive thing you can wield. Outside the window, the sun was tilting lower, the light turning richer gold, stretching the plane's shadow along the runway. It spilled into the cabin, grazing Tessa's face, making her eyes look like they held a whole sky about to change color. In moments, when the door sealed and the engines roared, the tension in the air would either dissolve or ignite. Tessa was certain. On this flight, it would be the latter. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but the wind had already shifted. From her seat, Tessa caught sight of the captain near the front of the cabin, close to the cockpit door. He was scanning a list, speaking quickly with an attendant. Everything seemed normal until the attendant's gaze suddenly swung toward her. A small gesture, a finger angled ever so slightly, was enough to tell Tessa she'd just become the center of that conversation. She didn't whip her head around. Instead, she kept her gaze neutral, fixed on the runway beyond the window. But in her peripheral vision, she saw the attendant lean close to the captain's ear. The engines swallowed most of the words, but a few escaped clearly enough. Flight risk. Tessa took a slow sip of champagne, letting the flavor stretch across her tongue, keeping her breath steady. The words didn't spark instant anger. They pulled the string of a bow, taut and waiting to release a sharp, ringing note. The captain gave a slight nod, glancing her way before returning to his list. The attendant walked off, his expression as smooth as the professional mask he'd worn from the start. But Tessa knew, in spaces like this, the real danger wasn't in what they said outright. It was in what they pretended not to say. She set her glass down, fingers lacing together, eyes no longer on the runway. She began to study the room, the sideways glances from nearby passengers, the subtle lean of another attendant at the back, even the way conversations around her left long, telling pauses. The atmosphere had shifted. No one was openly naming her, but someone had planted a seed, and the curious stares were proof it had begun to sprout. Across from her, a man leaned toward his seatmate, whispered something, and both briefly looked her way before fidgeting with their seatbelts. Tessa relaxed her shoulders, allowing a faint smile to touch her lips. It wasn't for anyone else. It was the smile of someone who'd just confirmed a theory. If they'd started branding her a flight risk, then the real storm was already building inside this cabin. And she knew, once people decided you were the problem, they'd work to make it true, even if it never was. What they didn't realize was that the hand poised to turn this storm was the very one they were trying to push out. A faint vibration sounded in the cabin, barely audible over the air system, but enough for nearby passengers to notice. The flight attendant's phone buzzed 3 short bursts, then went still. Less than a second later, it vibrated again. This time longer, slower, impossible to ignore. He shot a glance at the captain, then pulled the phone from his vest pocket. The glow of the screen lit his face, and in that instant, the confident, by-the-book demeanor cracked, replaced by something close to unease, maybe even fear. His finger hovered over the answer button as though weighing whether to take the call here or step away. The next buzz made the choice for him. "Excuse me," he murmured to the captain, stepping back toward the service galley. Tessa remained still, watching with the attentiveness of someone who already knew why. She didn't need to hear the conversation. She knew exactly who was on the other end. The same person who'd received her 8-word message at the security gate. Time to see how they play this out. In the galley's shadow, the attendant pressed the phone to his ear, voice low and urgent. More breath than sound. A few passengers glanced over, but no one dared to ask. Tessa swirled her champagne, watching the bubbles spiral upward as if counting down. Every passing second widened the cracks in the wall they'd tried to build around her. When the call ended, the attendant returned, his face locked in place like a mask, but his eyes still unsettled. He gave the captain a small nod, said something too quiet to catch, then retreated to the back. The captain didn't move, but his eyes cut toward Tessa, no longer with the same tone as before. This time, it was the look of a man who'd just been told the name of a passenger. A name he should have known from the start. Tessa set her glass down, leaning back slightly, her gaze on the window, lips curved in the faintest arc. It wasn't a victor's smile, it was the smile of someone who just nudged a single piece on the board. Enough to change the entire game. And in just minutes, whether the plane took off or not, everyone in the cabin would learn the truth. The board was never theirs to control. The chime of the intercom broke through the soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet rustle of first class. Every head turned toward the front, and then the captain's voice came through. Low, steady, deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, this flight is on temporary hold by order of the highest level management." The last words landed like pebbles in still water, small but enough to ripple through the entire cabin. Seats shifted, seatbelts clicked open. A few passengers leaned toward each other, whispering, "What happened?" Others stole glances at Tessa, as if she might have the answer, or worse, be the reason. Tessa didn't move. Her hand traced the stem of her champagne glass, eyes fixed on the serene expanse of the runway. The sunlight stretched golden and calm, no hint of mechanical failure or storm. The captain paused, then added, "Please remain seated. We'll update you when more information is available." The statement answered nothing and invited a dozen new theories. A man in the row ahead turned to look at Tessa longer than politeness allowed. A young woman tapped furiously on her phone, her thumbs blurring as she messaged someone outside. Tessa knew. This was the most interesting moment in any game of chess, when everyone knows something's happening but no one can name it. The more curious they got, the more likely they were to make mistakes. She drew a slow breath, set the glass down, and glanced toward the cockpit door. It stayed shut, but she could feel it. A conversation happening inside, one that revolved around her whether she was there or not. In the back row, a flight attendant avoided her gaze, rearranging an already tidy galley cabinet. Busy work for someone avoiding eye contact. Tessa wasn't in a hurry. She'd already moved her piece hours ago, and now she only had to wait for it to reach its destination. Outside, a white service vehicle rolled to a stop beside the plane. A man in a black suit stepped out, didn't glance around, and walked straight to the jet bridge. The air inside thickened, even those trying to appear relaxed shifted in their seats, bracing for something they couldn't quite define. And Tessa knew, when he entered, they'd understand that highest level management was more than just a title on paper. When the man in the black suit stepped into the cabin, the atmosphere changed instantly. No more scattered chatter, no more pretend page-turning. Postures straightened, eyes tracked only him. He looked at no one but Tessa. One small nod, subtle but enough for her to know that the move she'd made this morning had returned with exactly what she needed. Tessa set down her champagne, adjusted the collar of her blazer, and rose. The click of her seat release broke the taut silence. All eyes followed her. A few blinks came quicker than normal, as though people were trying to decode the scene. She didn't speak right away. Her steps down the aisle were measured, forcing each passenger, each crew member, to follow her with their gaze. She stopped midway, slipped a hand into her blazer pocket, and pulled out a gleaming metal card. The cabin lights caught on its surface, and without touching it, everyone could see. This was no ordinary ID. The airline's security protocol, Tessa said, her voice calm but carrying to every seat. Will be reviewed, starting with all of you. The words landed like a formal order. No one moved. Some stared at their shoes, others glanced to their colleagues as if waiting for instructions. The captain, still by the cockpit, blinked once and held still, one hand on the doorframe. Tessa didn't raise her voice or lean on emphasis. The weight was in her composure and in the undeniable authority that shimmered in that card. A flight attendant tried for a smile and failed, the corner of his mouth twitching. The man who'd fought her for the seat leaned back, gaze lowering. She swept her eyes across the cabin, letting them linger on certain faces from earlier conflicts. Not to shame, but to make clear that everyone understood why they were here, now, in this silence. Consider this your chance to fix what's broken, she added, tone dropping lower. Before we fix it another way. The card slid back into her pocket. She turned and walked to her seat. No one spoke. No one dared. And Tessa knew. In this moment, silence was the loudest sound she could have. The man in the black suit stepped forward, murmured something to the captain. Just a few words, enough for him to nod and move aside. 3 crew members appeared in the aisle. They carried no trays, no towels. One spoke, voice wrapped in professionalism but frayed at the edges. We need all staff involved in today's security process to step forward for a review. Tessa remained seated, watching. She didn't have to give the order. The attendant who had questioned her ticket was first, slow, reluctant, eyes darting away. Behind him came the check-in clerk who had asked, "Are you sure you booked first class?" Her forced smile looked frozen, brittle. One by one, the familiar faces from that morning filed into the aisle. Under the warm cabin lights, it felt like a silent procession, not on a red carpet, but toward exposure. Passengers began to understand. Some leaned out for a better view, some traded glances in disbelief. Across the aisle, the man who had challenged her for the seat shifted uncomfortably, realizing just how close he'd been sitting to the epicenter. When the group gathered at the rear, the man in the black suit motioned for them to follow. No protests, no excuses, just quiet footsteps leaving behind empty space and a new atmosphere. Surprise, curiosity, and a flicker of satisfaction from a few watching. Tessa lifted her champagne, watched the last bubbles pop. Her face held no obvious triumph, only the quiet contentment of someone watching the board turn in her favor. She set the glass down, leaned back. No words, no gestures, just silence. Enough to close the scene with a period so sharp everyone knew this wasn't luck. It was a lesson. And Tessa knew the passengers would retell it, not just as a story about a delayed flight, but about the moment those who thought they held power were made to walk out, in full view of everyone. The air in the cabin was thick as early morning sea fog, dense, damp, making every breath sound sharper than it should. The wheels of a rolling suitcase hummed across the carpet, the sound round and sustained, fading only when it met the wall. Each noise was like a comma in the silent, collective account everyone was writing together, without words, only with glances and heartbeats. Whispers flared and died as quickly as if they feared being overheard. No one dared let their gaze rest on Tessa, not even for a second. She sat with one hand on the armrest, not posturing as the center of attention, yet somehow every movement in the cabin still revolved around her. A flight attendant passed, fingers fussing at her scarf. She flicked a glance toward the empty space where the pulled staff had just stood, then lowered her head and kept walking, avoiding Tessa's eyes the way you avoid a spotlight. Tessa didn't smile, didn't frown. Her expression was that of a winter lake. still but holding a cold beneath that could halt anyone who dared touch it. Behind her, a passenger tried whispering to his seatmate. But in the low noise of the cabin, each word landed louder than they intended. Who is she? The question hung in the air, bounced off the bulkhead, and seemed to find its way back to Tessa. She didn't answer. Her gaze moved instead to the cabin door where light spilled in from the jet bridge. In that moment, she looked like someone who had seen the whole chessboard, opening to checkmate, and was now just waiting for the last piece to leave the table. The quiet was so deep that the sound of a zipper on someone's jacket came through like the turn of a safe's lock. Still seated, Tessa felt the undercurrent moving through the passengers around her. A mix of curiosity, wariness, and faint embarrassment. Then, breaking that rhythm, the PA crackled with a brief update on the new departure time. Even that voice carried caution, as if the speaker knew they were walking through air that had been permanently altered. Tessa lifted her champagne, swirling it, watching the thin foam cling to the rim before dissolving. Her eyes slid once more to the cabin door, as if awaiting a signal. The cue for the final cut. She stood. The movement was unhurried, not from hesitation, but so every gaze in the cabin had time to register what was coming. The teal blazer dress was still perfectly pressed, her steps sure, as though the aisle had been laid out for her alone. The cabin door opened, the jet bridge greeting her with cold white light. The overhead glare caught on the card in her hand, rigid plastic, small, yet enough to alter the fate of everyone who had touched the story. No need to raise it or brandish it. She simply held it at eye level and let the light do the rest. The embossed logo and line of text marking her top-tier authority gleamed like an answer that didn't need to be spoken. An airport manager waited at the end of the bridge. At the sight of the card, he faltered, as if realizing that the random actions of that morning had been recorded and would be remembered long after the flight. He stepped aside, bowing his head. A small gesture, but in this context, it was an apology compressed into silence. Tessa said nothing. Her silence from the first moment to now was never weakness. It was choice. The choice of someone who knows that words can dilute the weight of truth. Behind her, a few curious passengers leaned into the aisle to watch her go. Someone raised a phone but caught only her backlit silhouette. A photo might spread, but it couldn't capture the presence that had quieted the cabin minutes earlier. Crossing the yellow line toward the gate, Tessa glanced back at the cabin. Not as farewell, but as a mark. The look said, "You just took a test. Your scores are already on their way to headquarters." The manager beside her started to speak, but she gave only a small nod. It allowed him to breathe again, but not to forget the shadow this moment would cast in the weeks ahead. She walked on. Her suitcase wheels clicked in steady rhythm, echoing through the empty jet bridge. Each turn counted down to the moment when someone in some office would receive a call from the very person they had tried to diminish. And Tessa knew that call wouldn't begin with a greeting. The airport hallway swallowed her figure, but the aftershock of her presence still clung to the cabin, like a scent no one wanted to admit they noticed. No harsh words, no shouting match, yet she had somehow forced every sound on that flight to measure itself differently. Some accusations explode like fireworks, bright, loud, gone in seconds. But Tessa's silence was a slow, smoldering smoke, creeping into cracks, settling into memory, staying far longer than any roar. The cabin door closed, the plane readying for a new journey. Faces that had once been skeptical now avoided one another, afraid that a glance might count as confession. A flight attendant stood motionless in the aisle, lips pressed tight, eyes fixed forward. Fingers knotted together behind her back. In the airline's central office, an email had just gone out with a subject line no one wanted to see. Urgent report, review of procedures and personnel. Just a few lines, but enough for those involved to know a chain reaction had begun. And it wouldn't stop because they wished it. Tessa knew that too. But she didn't need to turn back to confirm it. She didn't need to witness awkward handshakes or hear procedural apologies. She understood that real change never comes from, "I'm sorry," but from the discomfort that flares every time someone remembers the moment they shot themselves in the foot. Outside, sunlight spilled over the tiled concourse, glittering as if nothing had happened. Travelers still pulled suitcases, checked departure boards, sipped coffee. Life moved on, as it always does. But somewhere in dimmer corners, conversations would begin with, "Remember that day?" And every time the image would return. A black woman in a teal blazer, holding a power card in silence. A reminder that some victories need no cheer. No one yet knew how the airline would change, or whose names would quietly disappear from the roster. But one thing was certain. No one would be bold or foolish enough to randomly select Tessa Caldwell ever again. Because sometimes silence isn't just an answer, it's the final warning. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.